It used to be the case that the mental health conditions were considered as originating within the individual pretty much entirely. So we could either talk in terms of bad genes, bad thought processes, bad learning experiences. And then more recently, there's a more enlightened tendency to look at the wider picture and to look at how mental health conditions could be due to our environment, not trees and fields and flowers and stuff, but the human designed environment, the world which we create for ourselves out of our thoughts. And so that's another way of looking at it. We don't need to blame the genes, which, as people have often said, the genes have been doing their job for millions of years. Now all of a sudden we're going to blame them for creating an epidemic of anxiety or depression or whatever. The genes are suddenly malfunctioning. Those damn genes. There's wretched genes. We should do some, we'll attack them, we'll do some gene surgery on them, we'll do some genetic modification, etc., etc. Thus distracting attention from what we've actually done ourselves, the world that we've actually made ourselves. Which is like, oops, did I just make that world? What? How could I have been so foolish as to make a world like that? But we don't do that. We assume the faults lie elsewhere. They possibly in individuals, possibly in genes, possibly in people's brains malfunctioning. So it is a braver step to look at maybe, well, we can't blame something like that. Maybe we're actually doing it to ourselves, collectively speaking. So we could say lots of things about the way that this might work, and people do. And so one thing we could say, just to give a throwaway example, is to say that what our culture does is to enshrine the rights of the ego, so as to say, anything you want you can have, you're worth it. And by the same token, anything you don't want to have. You don't have to have. We get upset and offended by stuff that we don't want to have because it's our right not to have it. So right there in a nutshell, we have this whole phenomenon of entitlement and the kind of brittle and completely ridiculous ego state that comes along with that entitlement, unrealistic as well as being brittle and ludicrous. Because what this imaginary thing called the ego likes or doesn't like, it doesn't really come into it, and it shouldn't come into it. Most assuredly shouldn't, because if it did, we'd design a farcical world, which indeed we have done. So that would make sense. And it makes sense why we want to create a world in which the ego or self-concept absolutely considers itself to be unquestionable. Whatever we want, we should have. Whatever we don't want, we absolutely shouldn't have. If I choose to have this certain set of beliefs about things, then absolutely nothing must ever contradict or offend against my set of beliefs. This brittleness, which it seems as if we're empowering ourselves, but we're not empowering ourselves, because what empowers us is to not be attached to particular mental constructs. Because if we're attached to a mental construct, we are the slave of that mental construct. And if we're the slave of that mental construct, we are that mental construct. And if we are the mental construct, then that means that there's been a disconnection with who we really are, which isn't a mental construct, obviously. But who we are is also not attached to any particular object, or it doesn't have any particular set of beliefs. And So to be who we really are means standing alone without environmental validation. So that's a tricky thing to get involved in, really. It's a path without any signposts. It's we don't know if what we're doing is right or not right. We've got nothing to go by, no yardstick. So it's a world where comparisons aren't possible. So we can say that it makes perfect sense that really the reason for all this social engineering is to further the cause of consumerism, capitalism, the game that we're currently playing. And all of that is true. And so maybe it's not such a throwaway example. But instead of looking at particular mechanisms or particular economic structures in society, we could actually look at things in a more essential way than that, and say that it all comes down to a kind of a war that is being waged, that is always being waged, not just in this modern time of ours. And the war is the war between the generic and the unique. And the generic and the unique necessarily exists this tension between them. So what we can say about the generic is that the generic is the environment that I was just talking about. That is a generic environment. It is an environment of the generic. And so what we can say about that generic environment, or about the generic in general, is that it is our enemy. It is our enemy because who we are is not the generic, and yet the generic insists that there be nothing else but the generic, because if the generic did not insist that, it couldn't exist. The generic exists by assuming a particular framework, never questioning that framework, and then because of the unquestionableness of this framework, it goes without saying that the right thing to do is to go around getting everyone to conform to this framework that we can't question. And when we do that, when we conform to a framework, then we become generic. That's what the generic is all about. Now, it's not that this is a conscious thought process. We don't go around thinking, I'm going to make everyone be like me, or we don't think, I'm going to make everyone conform to the framework. It's an instinctual, subconscious thing. Just like bullying is. So if I go around being a bully, I don't even think I'm being a bully. It's just a thing that I do, and I get pleasure, visceral pleasure out of it, but I don't analyze it. How would I want to analyze being a bully if I was a bully? So in the same way, identifying with the generic and acting upon other people so as to make them generic as well, so to make them fit the bill, is a purely instinctual thing, completely unconscious thing. It's not something we think about at all, but we're very strong in doing it. We're very forceful in doing it. And the whole of human culture consists of converting the individual into generic units. That is the name of the game entirely. So when we impose our beliefs on our children, we are cutting short their period of being individuals. Because when you adhere to a belief, totally adhere to a belief, there's no way you can be an individual. You can't say, well, I am an individual who chooses to have this generic belief. Because if you were an individual, you would not choose that. And in fact, you never did choose it. It's not a question of choosing. So there is this dynamic going on, which is the backdrop to everything. The war, if we can call it such, is not really the best word, perhaps, but just stick with it for a little bit. The war between the generic and the unique. And in one sense, to call it a war isn't quite right, because we very, very quickly lose it, and we don't even realize we've lost it. We get converted, and we never see what's happened, and we never see that there has been a war, and we never see that we've lost and we've been overwhelmed by the side, by the enemy, by the side which is our enemy, which seeks to annihilate our individuality, our uniqueness, utterly annihilate it. And it's very, very easy to see how we are going to be overwhelmed, how we are going to lose this struggle before we even realize that there is a struggle, even though we kind of realize it, but we never really see the significance of it. It is so important for us to have human relationships, relate to other humans, have a sense of being understood, have a sense of belonging, being able to partake in whatever everyone else is, but being able to engage. So much of life lies in the field of social interaction. That's how we grow. And it's also necessary economically, because unless we interact with other people, we can't make a living for ourselves. We can't just go our own way, have nothing to do with everyone else. From one point of view, we won't be able to get a job, we won't be able to take part in society. From another point of view, it's necessary for our growth to get on with other people. That's how we learn about ourselves. It's how we develop, I guess. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it is important. It helps us. So we want all that, but the price is that we have to play the same game that everyone else is playing. And the pressure to do this is immense. From a very early age, we feel that if we're out of step, it's hugely embarrassing, and we want more than anything else to be just like everyone else and not stand out. So, as we all know, this kind of socialization thing is incredibly powerful, immensely powerful. And there is bullying that comes into it, because if we find that we can't adapt, that we can't become like everybody else, then we will be bullied. Of course we will. That's the automatic thing to happen. That is the generic system asserting itself and sweeping away anything in its path that comes across these little irritants, these little errors, these little things that aren't it. And it attacks them. It is unashamedly hostile to them. That's how it works. If we were to allow the individual or the unique, that would make us uncomfortably aware that we have denied the individual or the unique in ourselves, and that would be a terrible awareness to have to contend with. And yet every time we see someone who is free, that's what we are reminded of. Maybe not consciously, but on some deep level, we are confronted with that awareness that we'd much rather not have. So seeing people who are free reminds us that we aren't free. We don't like that. We don't want to be reminded, so we will make sure there aren't people who are free. Or, to put it the other way, when we come across people who are truly themselves, truly individual, we don't like that in general. And because that reminds us of how we've denied our own individuality. Now, it is the case that sometimes we do celebrate people for being unique, but this is a kind of it's kind of like what they say about people who are ascribed the title of being a genius. They're geniuses. So because they're geniuses, we let them be odd and eccentric. And say, oh, yeah, geniuses have to be like that. That's what geniuses are like. So we're kind of making it okay. But at the same time, we're using the fact that they're genius. Einstein would be a classic example. We like for Einstein to be a genius, and we like the idea of that they are geniuses. But that doesn't threaten our world order at all, because we've put them in a special class that is no longer threatening. The same would be true for, say, writers who write in a way that is out of kilter with the social requirements of the day, like James Joyce. Afterwards, we'll celebrate him, because it's as if by celebrating him, we do celebrate the ideal of uniqueness. But we're not doing that really. It's kind of a cheat. We're pretending that we do, but we don't, by jumping on the bandwagon once it's safe to do so. When James Joyce was actually alive, he was persecuted like hell. And everyone wants to claim they're kind of totally behind him and totally with him the whole step after the event, after he's dead. So we have a funny sort of relationship. We do benefit from the contributions of individuals who are actually misfits. We benefit greatly because they're the only people who do provide us with new ways of looking at the world, and without new ways of looking at the world, we stagnate. We stagnate and die. Well, mentally die at least. Maybe we'll stagnate and die physically as well, but we do stagnate and die. So society needs the outliers. It really, really needs them. And we can celebrate them after a fashion, in the sense that once they're established as having contributed something, we'll say good things about them, pretend that we're right behind them. But at the time, when they're actually there and they're actually saying things that are non-generic, we will resist them to the core, and we will condemn them, and we will ostracize them and marginalize them and all the rest of that kind of stuff, because that's how systems work. This is actually nothing else than pure thermodynamics. A system maintains itself by one thing and by one thing only. It has a particular dynamic called regime, which it adheres to, and anything that isn't part of that regime is you could call it a random fluctuation. It comes along, but it's not part of the standard way of things supposed to be. It's kind of going some crazy kind of way of its own. So what the system does, it damps down fluctuations. It's like a wave comes along and you damp it down so it's no longer a wave. You've squashed it. And that isn't just the thing that happens the odd time. All equilibrium systems persist by damping down all dissenting voices, all random fluctuations. It's basic theory. That's how it works. One rule is king, anything else doesn't get a look in. But every now and again, by a fluke or by something that looks like a fluke, could be a fluke, it could be something else, a fluctuation gets through, and instead of being damped, it actually gets amplified. So that's the basis of complexity theory, chaos theory, non-linear thermodynamics. It gets amplified. And this tiny little thing, which should have been crushed at birth and almost always would be, because it's so weak and small and defenseless, and the system is so big and strong and bullying, that it almost always would do, but every now and again it gets through and changes everything. And that's how things change. That's how evolution takes place. And then we say, oh, isn't it good? But we're only saying that because we're part of the next generation. We resist it until it's a fact, and then we'll suck up to that, and we'll resist the next thing to come along. So that's human beings. That's how we are. It's profoundly undignified, extraordinarily undignified. But that's the way we will be when we are adapted to the equilibrium world, because that's the way equilibrium systems work. Now, from the point of view of me, when I'm adapted to the equilibrium system, and I'm the generic output of that system in that case, from my point of view, that's not good. It's not beneficial to me. It's good for the system because it's the system's bread and butter. The system has to convert everything into its own output. It has to put its stamp on everything. It has to stay the system. It has to do that. It's good for the system, healthy for the system. But for me, because essentially I am not a generic unit, I'm not a part of the system, it's not good for me. It has annihilated the core of who I really am, repressed it. It split me off from it, alienated me from it, made me ashamed of it or frightened of it or fearful, whatever. And now I'm in this situation where I'm being untrue to myself on a constant daily basis. So then we can say, well, when the generic wins like this and crushes all the unique, the individual, when it crushes the unique, then that is the cause of what we call the mental health conditions. Basically, we're being murdered, not at birth, but shortly afterwards, as soon as we get old enough to be socialized. So in that way, you could say that our parents conspire to murder us, or that society as a whole conspires to murder us. It murders us and resurrects a generic self in place of us, and no one notices the difference. Okay, thanks for watching.